All right, everyone, it's time to discuss the proposed Trump budget, the Trump change tax plan, and etc. Various cuts to agencies, military spending, and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, I support the idea of Trump cutting bureaus and programs. The more the merrier. I would cut much more than Trump is planning, although I don't think I'd prioritize Medicaid and some of these other programs and SNAP benefits. I think I'd prioritize military spending through eliminating no-bid contracts first and foremost. I'd drop that cost. You could add 10% to the military budget as he's proposing. You'd still end up spending less. That being said, Trump's plan will only work with tax reform. The plan that he's put forward, while good in spirit, is going to screw the poor and the working class over, half the population of the United States, if it's not coupled with tax relief that can actually get them jobs to lift them up out of those rungs. The goal of the American government should be to structure its tax forms in such a way that it is as simplistic as possible, as efficient as possible, requires as few agencies involved as possible to actually make the tax system work, while limiting taxes to as low a level as possible, especially upon the working class, the lower productive classes, lower middle class, working class. So the true middle class, I would say, needs to be included. They've been hammered. Small businesses, entrepreneurs. Those are the main driver of productivity within any healthy economy. Instead, what we've got right now is multinational corporations that don't pay taxes. They create the jobs. They're almost all very, very low-wage jobs. For every 20, minimum wage workers, you're getting one person who rises up to the lower middle class and is lucky for it. And if you change this, you don't have a problem with, for instance, subsidizing student loans. The number of people that would have to be subsidized would be far less if we had true tax reform. The problem with the United States is that we have a sky-high business tax rate that fucks small businesses, the self-employed, regional chains. While that same extremely high rate is not applied to corporations that can simply offshore. They can invest and build a factory elsewhere, and they frequently do. They put their money overseas. They don't pay anything. Even the assets they have on paper, they take so many write-offs that they don't really pay anything. Some of them actually get money back from the government despite employing tens, hundreds of thousands of people. That shouldn't be happening. If you take care of that issue and no-bid contracts within the military, we can balance our budget without cutting anything. Now then, what about welfare in general? What do I feel about it? I think that it should be as sparing as possible. The way to achieve that is not to eliminate or cut programs that people have become reliant upon, but rather to lift them up out of poverty by restructuring the tax code, especially the business tax code, so that as few people as possible are reliant on those programs. Once you solve that problem, it becomes easy to subsidize them. It becomes peanuts to the overall economy, and 3% growth or more is achievable under such a tax code. But Trump's cuts on their own, unless he gets the tax reform and more than he's actually suggested, won't actually work. His budget as laid forth here that he's suggesting will not work without comprehensive tax reform. We need to move to a much, much more simplistic system. We then need to slash bureaucracy as much as humanly possible. I'm not talking about Ronald Reagan freezing the growth of bureaucracy so the private economy can catch up. I'm not talking about a few targeted cuts. I'm talking about taking a chainsaw and hacking these agencies apart. I'm talking about combining agencies whose roles overlap. For instance, the NSA shouldn't exist. It should be overlapped with the FBI and probably cut by about 90%. Make it a subsidiary of the FBI. Longer history, usually more competent. Subjugate it to them. Eliminate the DHS. It's a new agency. FEMA can operate on its own. It doesn't need to be part of that. Bring back the Civil Defense Force. Partially privatize it to react to things instead of just having FEMA that half the time doesn't even function, let's face it. Eliminate no-bid contracts within the military. Ask ourselves, should we really be spending 100 times as much on some new type of aircraft when we could build 10 times as many last generation aircraft that still perform perfectly well and simply overwhelm any enemy with massive superiority without even building a new system. They were talking about, oh, let's get rid of the A-10, you know, the most survivable aircraft that we've got that terrifies everybody when it comes around. Finally, they get the bright idea, oh, okay, well, it'll actually cost less. Instead of replacing it, we'll just sort of overhaul it, make a next version of it. And that works just fine. It's just as dangerous as the one we had before. Wonderful. We saved a lot of money. Trump, as a big money president, needs to do more to hammer the bureaucracy of this country. He needs to absolutely slash and burn it, because that's where a lot of our money is really going. The programs themselves, if they were administered by a more effective apparatus, something more efficient, it would be much more cost effective. People could actually get more welfare and it wouldn't even be a problem. We'd still be saving money, because most of that money is squandered on the agencies required to disperse it, in all honesty. As for his idea of tax reform, Trump has proposed dropping the business tax, which is good. And when people said, oh, that's corporate cronyism, it's not. The multinational corporations pay zero, generally speaking. They can't pay less than they're already paying. This gives relief to small businesses. You get those small businesses to grow. You get more people in the managerial class. You get more skilled workers. You get more growth in general. A lot of people that right now are in the working class would rise to the lower middle class. People in the lower middle class would rise to the middle class. People who are on the margins of total poverty would at least be able to, they'd be able to have at least an apartment and enough food in their belly. You wouldn't need to give many people welfare. If that were the case, it would cost less because fewer people would be reliant on it. We would reverse the trend, the slow death march towards central planning and socialism if we accomplish this. We could usher in decades of nonstop high-level growth. And the war on poverty, when the New York Times here, by the way, says Trump wants to eliminate programs that help with poverty. When the war on poverty began, that's when poverty began to be a problem in this country. Because the same politicians that were catering to a small proportion of the population and tugging on the emotional heartstrings of the middle and upper middle class in order to get that to be popular enough to accomplish it, also put into place programs and tax codes and bureaucracy and regulations that forced many others into poverty. When they realized how many more people were impoverished and how likely they were to vote for these same heart-tugging politicians, they decided it was a good idea to keep them perpetually impoverished. This is a problem of too much government. It's not a problem of too few programs to address welfare needs, because those welfare needs were a lot smaller before we started instituting such programs. We need to cut the head off the snake of socialism now, before we end up in a situation like Venezuela or Brazil, where when you finally realize you've run out of money, and you have no choice but to cut programs or go into such massive debt you collapse your own economy and undergo some sort of weird populist revolution, whereby at that time, millions of people take to the streets. If we cut the head off the snake now, and this is half of the solution, but it's only half, and it has to be coupled with tax reform and deregulation as much as is humanly possible. We need all of Congress to come together to do that, at least on the GOP side and some of the more sane Jim Webb-style Democrats. If they don't do that now, we will continue this march and things will be worse. We kick the can down the road maybe 10 years, 20, 30 years. We strangle our productivity. We fall behind China. We fall behind most of the world, honestly. And our economy will take a hit. Poverty will continue to grow, as it has continuously grown since the war on poverty began. The problem gets worse, and then when we run out of money, when a third of the population is reliant upon the government and another third at least takes some welfare, then you have riots when you attempt to address that problem. When people finally realize, oh yeah, we're running into debt, we can't pay for these programs, and so a bunch of neoconservatives get elected, or something further right, you know, actually on the right, like paleocons, libertarians, in order to solve the problem created by socialists, which includes half the GOP on their military token. They're big spenders when it comes to that. They love corporate welfare. They're socialists for corporations and for the military. They're socialists. When it finally comes due that has to be done, that there's no other option available to us, then you need martial law. You end up like Venezuela. You end up like Brazil. You end up like Argentina when they were having their crisis, or any other randomly chosen left-wing state. Central planning, interventionism, social welfare, corporate welfare, big military spending, they don't work. And by the way, we need to stop our involvement overseas. Where we're not involved with bombing ISIS forces, we shouldn't even be there. If we have a base, a consulate, an embassy, that's fine to guard it. But sending troops out with drones and tanks and everything else costs a shit ton of money. We have a really, really well-trained, battle-hardened military from a decade and a half of proxy war, and nothing to actually use it on, because those troops can't even deal with ISIS forces. We're conducting drone wars on them, largely. Public will's not in favor of any invasions. So what's the point? Bring back the civil defense, eliminate the DHS, eliminate the NSA, eliminate virtually all surveillance in this country that's not regulated by a proper honest-to-goodness warrant issued by a proper honest-to-goodness court. I'm not talking about a fucking FISA court run by an extrajudiciary body. I'm talking about returning to the way that we did things when they were working. That's the common sense that we need in this country. What we need to do is look back at our past, look around the world as well today, find out what works and what's efficient, what we can and cannot pay for. It needs a massive overhaul. Our system doesn't work for the average American. Most Americans right now are either in poverty or barely getting by. Half of them don't even have $1,000 in the bank. They can't even deal with a medical emergency. That's not their fault because they were lazy. It's the fault of the government for structuring the economy in such a way that there aren't enough well-paying jobs for them. They did this by favoring Walmart and McDonald's over small businesses that would be willing to pay more, that are local, that have a better reputation to uphold. Or regional chains that can be more efficient. Entrepreneurs that can drive the next wave of energy technology, of academia and everything else under the sun. They're the ones we need to turn to. It's the private marketplace. It's the population itself that has that strength. Intervention never will. One central government body at the federal level dispersing all welfare is the least efficient system you can use. So while I like Trump's idea, his proposal in theory, in practice it will fall short of actually, it may be helpful in some ways, but it screws the lower and middle classes. It will screw them over if it's not coupled with tax reform, and the tax reform should come first. You institute tax reform so that small businesses aren't going under, so that farmers can make a living, so that entrepreneurs aren't getting screwed. You know, we have to pay a second tax on our income, you know that. It's a self-employment tax of 15% on top of the regular income tax. Only by having business-related write-offs can you even survive. You shouldn't have to do that. The tax rate should be low enough so you won't need those write-offs. It should be capped at a far lower level. Nobody should be paying as much as they pay. That includes the lower middle class. Why should they have to pay 10%, 15% of their income? They should be paying a single-digit total. The middle class, they shouldn't be paying 20, 25, 30%. They should be paying 10, maybe 15. The businesses, they shouldn't be paying 38% or whatever arcane total it is. It should be like 25 should be the maximum. No person should ever pay more than 25% of their income, in my opinion. But multinational corporations and the wealthy that currently pay very little should have to pay their fair share. That would solve, I think, the problem. That's about all. Peace out.